And here we are, folks, back in Silly Goose Gang, episode 18. And joining us tonight is Professor Jeffrey Meldrum, Professor of Anatomy and Anthropology at Idaho State University, which I believe would make you, if my college football knowledge is okay, a Bengal, Idaho State Bengals.
Yeah, that's right.
That's not bad. See, I know my college football and call it American.
It's got to be in the high desert of the Rocky Mountains. I guess at some point we had a sister city in India or something, and that was where the Bengal tiger came into being. So,
yeah,
curious bit of history.
Yeah, definitely. I was just a little bit of a sports fan and follow American football. American football, as I call it, football as you would call it.
Right.
So I follow it pretty closely. So yeah, Idaho State Bengals. But thank you for joining us on this episode. We really appreciate you taking the time to jump on and have a chat with us.
My pleasure. Always willing to chat about this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. I always think it's one of the things that I find amazing just from doing this is when time is so precious. So when anybody gives you any time, just to be extremely thankful that somebody wants to talk, it's really cool. So thank you.
Good.
So yeah, where do we begin, Jeff? Where do we begin? This is one of your specialist areas. One of these it's one of these topics that is fascinating to a lot of people around the world. The folklore.
Right.
So I have been listening to a few podcasts and a few YouTube videos that you've done over the last few days. So just for the sake of listeners, do you just give us a little brief introduction to yourself and your background?
Sure. Well, I grew up in the Pacific and Intermountain West here of North America, and so as a youngster, it was just there was an interesting convergence of the stars. Almost, it seemed that I was about 11 years old when Roger Patterson, who shot that very famous piece of film footage in Northern California, came through Spokane, Washington, where I was living, and that was one of the earliest public showings of the documentary showcasing that piece of footage. And so, I was as a youngster was always fascinated with nature. I was, had my insect collection. I had my menagerie of little critters in various aquarium tanks and screen boxes and so forth, always bringing snakes home and smuggling them into my bedroom and things like that. And so, and I was fascinated too with human prehistory. I was the notion of cavemen and human evolution had piqued my curiosity, and so this film seemed to embody all of those interests in one very interesting, intriguing package. And so I was fascinated by it, and one thing led to another, and did research. Read Patterson's book, found out about John Green by coincidence. John Green, a Canadian journalist who had written another very informative book at that time. His niece was my librarian at school, at grade school, and so was introduced to his writings, and it continually fascinated me. I mean, just the fundamental aspect of the mystery of some unknown creature, entity, animal occupying or inhabiting the woods that I frequented. And so as time went on, and maybe your listeners haven't heard this. I was going to say this is a question I frequently answer, and so I hate to be redundant, but it may be some new listeners. But as time went on, I ended up eventually, as the career sort of roulette wheel spun, there were a limited number of selections on that wheel, but I ended up going to the university and studying physical anthropology, anatomical sciences, actually, with an emphasis in physical anthropology. That was constrained somewhat by the economy at that time, and there's always cycles of hiring and saturation of various disciplines. And as it turned out, anthropology was quite filled to the max. There were no more positions really. So I was strongly encouraged, though, to go into anatomical sciences, given my interest in locomotion, which was in part, spawned by fascination with Bigfoot tracks, with footprints, and with the mechanisms of bipedalism that distinguished Sasquatch from humans, and how we came to walk on two legs. And did this creature share that legacy directly with us, or was it a convergence of selection pressures for the habit of walking on two legs? And so all those things kind of were this synergistic snowball, and I eventually ended up back in the Intermountain West here in Pocatello, and some opportunities just sort of dropped in my lap as a result of that involved me in the analysis of some video footage that was shot down in Northern California, and also some footprints. I brought up face to face with a long line of 15-inch tracks in southeastern Washington state. And I tell you, when you actually witness tracks, and there's a whole spectrum. People need to realize this. It isn't there are tracks or there are not tracks. There's a whole spectrum of the expression of quality and information in footprints, given the age, given the substrate, given the circumstances. And this was an exceptional example where very loamy, silty soil of southeastern Washington, and wet conditions, and a farm access road that was, unimproved, just a dirt track, basically. So these tracks were pristine. They were definitely less than 8 hours old. And I knelt down and could actually see skin ridge detail, the fingerprint patterns or on the sole, transferred from the sole to the footprint, that were still there with some expression. They didn't last long, unfortunately, due to the rainy, wet conditions. But this was 35, 45 clear footprints in succession. There was no room for ambiguity. It either was hoaxed or it was the real deal. And I pride myself in, at least to the extent that I can pretty much tell the difference, or at least weigh in the balance the probability of one or the other of those two options. And the details, the animation, the tension cracks, the pressure ridges, the drag-ins and drag-outs, the skin ridge detail, the action of the toes, the splayed position in at one particular step in the appropriate circumstances, and where it was running or sliding, the flexion of the toes curling in tightly and leaving very deep impressions in contrast. There was just no way. There was just no way that Paul Freeman, who had taken me out, this witness, could have fabricated, or anyone else for that matter, as far as I was concerned. And so I was in the company of my brother. We had gone up to make a visit on Dr. Grover Krantz by chance at Pullman, Washington. We're on our way back and stopped in and made this unannounced visit to this individual, and gained his confidence. And he then confided that he had actually just found some tracks that very morning before we'd arrived. And I was incredulous, what? And he said, well, yeah, you want to see them? I said, well, sure. And so we went up into the foothills, and boom, there they were. And I was pinching myself, how can this be? This just can't. And but it was quickly evident that for all his skill as an outdoorsman, he didn't understand the functional morphology of the foot. And you can be a tracker. That's the distinction, important distinction. You can be a tracker and not understand what's going on underneath the skin. But I could see those cues, those indications of the articulation, of the flexibility, of the expansion of the sole pad, the flexion of the toes, number of joints that are indicated in the toes and so on. And it was just kind of going over his head. He clearly had that glazed-eyed look that my students sometimes get when I get moving a little too fast for them. And so if he didn't do it, I can't imagine anyone else going to the trouble under those weather conditions, because chances are it could have stormed up quite seriously and washed them out, and all your effort would have been for naught. But as it was, so that's a very long answer to how it got started. But my brother and I, we hustled around and found a hardware store and got some plaster and did a lot of photography and examination and some cutting some sign to see exactly what had happened. That was the other thing that was so impressive, is Paul had kind of surmised what he thought had happened, that it had come along here and made this little hairpin turn down in the field, and then came up and disappeared going the other direction. Well, it just didn't make sense based on what was there. And I thought, if he's right at all, there's got to be, then there should be more sign off in this particular direction. We couldn't find anything. And I thought, well, maybe he's got it differently. And we started marking out each individual footprint, just really assessing what was going on. Found the flexion point where it had done the hairpin turn on the opposite end of the seam, and had then bolted back for cover along this big irrigation ditch where there was all sorts of brush and brambles there, and found tracks far beyond any sign of his activity. So he'd read the sign 180 degrees backwards. So if he was responsible, why would he portray it that way to me? And so anyway, we made some plaster casts and did a lot of photography and examined it carefully. And boy, I tell you, that drive home, it was about a 5-hour drive back to Boise to embark from. And it was, we were, the implications were sinking in. My gosh, they really do exist. Because even though I had this youthful enthusiasm from back in my grade school days, that interest, had waxed and waned. And of course, no major breakthroughs, just the same old. And, Dr. Krantz had done some work, but there were no, the biggest breakthrough was actually his papers, I think, papers on the dermatoglyphics that were found also in this area of Walla Walla. But no breakthroughs, nothing significant. And, so my skepticism was pretty keen, but we did this kind of on a lark. I had been invited to evaluate this piece of video footage, and I thought, this will be just a fun exercise. Kind of nostalgic, a fun exercise to revisit the topic, but easily point out the zipper and demonstrate my anatomical acumen in doing so. And the more I scrutinized and stared at this and considered it and looked at it and the impact of it and so forth, I couldn't find a zipper. And in fact, I started picking out details of anatomy. There were not to be expected in an off-the-shelf costume. Yeah. And so it was quite, at that time I was very keenly aware of the abuse that Dr. Krantz had suffered at the hands of his colleagues and the scientific establishment, as he called it. And there was, I've often said, there was a little imp on the shoulder whispering in my ear, "Do you really want to do this? Are you sure you want to go down this road?" And the other one says, "How can you not? What an what a fascinating scientific question. And here you see evidence that really is compelling. Everyone should be convinced, I think." That's obviously not the case, but that's kind of what set me down the road. And so now, that was 96. What is it? 20 some years later, and 300 plus footprint casts in my lab later. It's and I think there have been some breakthroughs. There have been some insights that have built upon what Dr. Krantz did, but clearly have extended our understanding of the model the form and function of the Sasquatch foot as revealed in the footprint data set, but I think we're right on the verge of getting some DNA evidence eventually, and hopefully that will tip the scales, if not conclusively demonstrate the presence of a novel unknown species. Sorry to ramble. That's
no, that's
super
fantastic.
interesting.
Yeah, so there was a few, like quite a few pieces in there, Jeff. So these footprints, in terms of location, how are they a long way from a town or village, or quite close? In terms of proximity to civilization, essentially.
right. Well, obviously, it takes two elements to have a footprint found, reported, and that's there has to be a track maker, and then someone who discovers it. So obviously, the tracks found in remote spots are more infrequently found or reported, rather, because they're infrequently found by human witnesses. In this case, in this particular example, we didn't have to go very far up in the foothills. And this was February. The snow was just melting back. And so our winter, snow's just melting back. And what this witness would do is, as the lower roads became accessible, and in this area, it's starting to change now, but at that time, pardon me, but at that time, many of the roads, they were tertiary roads. They weren't even gravel roads. They were dirt roads, just bladed with a bulldozer, and or grader. And so when they were wet or when they're very dry and powdery, they take tracks extremely clearly. And there's so there's a lot of, any animal that's crossing from one side to the other leaves sign. So what he would do is, as soon as some of these lower foothill roads right adjacent to or just up into the national forest were accessible, he'd start driving and just look for any place that a Sasquatch had crossed the road or had walked along the shoulder of the road. And these were reportedly the first tracks that he had found of that particular season. And so they were, right on the border of the national forest. And they, in that part of Washington, they cultivate right up to that boundary. Some of the foothills there, they use these big D9, diesel caterpillars to pull their plows and discs and so forth. So they cultivate on some pretty steep, uneven terrain. Plus, the little valleys and glens, oftentimes are or steep slopes thereof are not cultivated, but they had old pioneer orchards of plums and apples. And so many of these had been abandoned, and the plums are just growing wild, and they hold their fruit up, can hold their fruit for quite some time, sometimes without dropping them. Or even if they do, they just freeze underneath the trees, and come spring, they melt out and start to thaw, and they do get a little ripe sometimes, a little fermented, but there's actually some funny stories. There was one incident found where it seemed from the sign that the Sasquatch had gleaned a bunch of this thawed out plums and then got sick, and the tracks led to, there was an old, what they call the Coyote School. It's an old abandoned building that the roof is collapsed on, but the sub basement still, it actually makes kind of a shelter. Sometimes animals do nest in there, wild animals, but the tracks led into that area, and it had literally vomited because there was this pile of vomit that was just full of plum pits. And that's what we suspected happened, is that it had just eaten too many of these fermented plums and unfortunately couldn't keep them down. And out came the whole mess with all the plum pits. So they just had eaten them, bit and all, stone them. So the thought is that perhaps in the spring, when the snows are melting back, and you have that green zone where it starts to green up, and the forbs and herbs and whatnot are growing, and young shoots are coming up, that the Sasquatch, like so many other animals, omnivores or herbivores, are taking advantage of that terrain. And so their footprints are discovered in that area, fairly close to some ranch buildings and so forth. And occasionally you get stories. A lot of times the ranchers or the farmers don't talk about it. They don't want a cavalcade of people marching across their spring wheat planting, looking for footprints.
So this is what I meant in terms of, you know, the location, Jeff. Is it, you know, some of these farmers, you know, they don't want cameras and film crews. They don't want a hassle. They just want to, you know, farm and get on with life. So you know, it sounds it's kind of in that kind of area where it's you know, the guys don't want anybody around there, and it's not near a big city. So if somebody wanted to hoax it, they would have to travel and climb, and they would have to really want to do that.
And it happens. I mean, it happens. There are examples that are obviously example. I mean, as I said, you know, we were talking about that spectrum of quality. Well, so there's a lot of gray area, sort of ambiguity, where people think they may have found a footprint when in reality it's probably just a pothole or a puddle or something like that, or the track of another animal misidentified, like a bear with its toes, or even sometimes in the wintertime, bounding animals like deer will leave a succession of punch marks in say 3 foot plus snow banks or snow cover, and that melts out a little bit, and from an angle, if you're not looking down into the hole to see the individual hoof prints, if there's that much detail, from an angle, it looks like a remarkably, sometimes even alternating series of steps. But amongst that mix, there are some examples where people have clearly tried to plant evidence, and it happens, but it's I think, extremely rare. Those are the exceptions rather than the rule. When I look through the tracks that I have, the vast majority are either, I think, the real deal or misidentification. And then like I said, the occasional over-interpreting. We've had a rash of human footprints too that have been reported, and the justification is offered that they're, like you point out, found in very remote, isolated areas where it would be hard to imagine anyone tromping around barefoot. But they show all the hallmarks of a human footprint, from the longitudinal arch, the well-developed ball. You know, first of all, they're not very big. You know, they're in the human size range. So on average, about 9, 10 inches. They have a well-differentiated big toe from the smaller toe pads with a very steep angle at the lateral. The fifth toe is often bent in from shoe wear to where it's almost lying on its side. Very narrow heel. One of the things that differentiates Sasquatch, because, you know, as anyone would remember back to their college physics, that volume increases to the cube of linear dimensions. And so, whereas surface area only increases to the square. So body mass is getting disproportionately big relative to the increase in size of the surface area of the sole of the foot, which has to distribute that weight. And so there are only so many ways that a big primate, a big hominoid, can solve that challenge. One is to not have an arch, which focuses weight on the ball and the heel. So it greatly increases the plantar pressures under those points of the foot. And we have modified them accordingly. So we've got a big, thick heel pad, and we've got a well-differentiated ball under the joint at the base of our big toe. So if we don't do that, we keep the foot flattened out and thicken out the sole pad, and more than anything, widen the foot. Make the heel and the forefoot wider, then that distributes the weight over a greater surface area. And Krantz did some really elegant calculations, actually, you know, trying to show how, with those kind of things combined with other behavioral differences, like Sasquatch are described as walking with a very compliant gait, we call it. That means that the joints of the leg are flexed, so that some of that force of impact can be taken up by the ligaments and tendons spanning the joints of the foot, the ankle, the knee, and the hip. And by doing that, and scientific experiments have been done, where that behavior is even utilized by humans in certain athletic endeavors, you can reduce the impact forces, what we call the ground reaction forces, by as much as 18-20%. So you combine that with the increased breadth, with the increased surface area due to the flat, flexible foot, and the Sasquatch actually has to tolerate poundage per square inch on par with that humans experience, which, is, if you're running or jumping or whatever, is probably, close to the limits of tolerance for those tissues, for those soft tissues and hard tissues of the foot. And
interesting. Going on that point, I did certainly not to the level you did, Jeff, but I did sports sciences at university.
Yes.
So I did biomechanics and the gait analysis of sprinting. So some of what you're talking about is casting my mind back to 20 years ago when I was sat in the lecture theatre listening to outstanding professors like yourself. So just if I understand it, would that then be the case that would the Sasquatch not be able to like dorsiflex? Would it be almost like a very flat foot, just to take it to the extreme, like an elephant or something along those lines, where it's a very flat, thick pad, whereas a human can obviously dorsiflex, run on the ball, create that ground reaction force to increase its speed? Would the Sasquatch then not be able to do that? Is that kind of the big difference, or?
They're not, obviously not as extreme as these very graviportal animals, we call them, like the elephant, where the limbs are, as you point out, rather extended. So even when an elephant runs and gets a little momentum going, it's a pretty extended, stiff-legged. They keep the limbs straight to avoid bending stresses. So, I mean, Sasquatch may, especially the big ones, I mean, I don't think that they're as big as some people suggest. I mean, this notion of what have been called true giants that are 12 and 14 feet tall just is, I mean, there's no evidence to back that up. The largest credible footprint I have ever witnessed is 19 inches. And that would equate to, 9 to 10 feet in height, probably. But the average foot length, without any regard for gender differences, which may impact body mass and, robusticity of the skeleton and so forth, is about 16 and a half inches. So that would equate to about, at the very most, about 8.5 feet tall, and probably weigh about 1,300 pounds. I mean, so they're, when you look at other animals like polar bears, they're pushing that, or large brown bears are getting close to that, moose and so forth. They're not constrained by the extreme adaptations that are necessary, like in an elephant. But so with that flat foot, going back to that notion, the flat foot, it appears that the Sasquatch foot has retained a primitive condition that we find in other great apes to varying degrees. And that is, in the absence of the development of that longitudinal arch, the joints of the instep, which in humans twist into a more stable, rigid position, so that we can use the foot as a lever to have that forward impulse, and use the plantar flexors of the calf muscles to really create force. They have retained a much greater range of motion through the midfoot, which is a primitive adaptation that first was selected for by grasp climbing adaptations with the presence of a divergent big toe. And so, see, some of my critics have argued, well, then if you have a non-divergent big toe, why would you have a flexible foot? Doesn't make any sense. It would make more sense to have an arch. Well, there are other selection pressures for having an arch besides those that eliminate the non-divergent, or eliminate a divergent big toe. And so there are advantages to the Sasquatch foot to retain that degree of flexibility. And we see that in, one, by not having an arch. Well, by not having a big toe, you don't need the big toe. And because if you're 1,200, 1,300 pounds, you don't want to be climbing up into a tree. A 10-foot fall could be, mortal. It could be lethal, rather. So not, if you don't need it for grasping, there's advantages not to have this appendage jutting out at an angle where it's going to get caught on things when you walk around. So, I think that very early in their evolution, they had lost the divergence of the big toe. We actually see a trend. If you look at, say, gibbons, chimpanzees, chimps, and not orangs, keep orangs. Orangs have solved that problem by just eliminating the toe altogether. So they have a little nubbin down here. Oftentimes it has no nail, and they just use that hind foot as a hook. So they've gone in an extreme direction. But if you go to terminate with mountain gorillas, which are most terrestrial of all the great apes, they have a reduction in the divergence of the big toe, much more robust big toe that often is held more in a line with the other digits. Not entirely, but
one thing that's quite interesting is, so if let's assume that this thing is 100% real, would there be a case then for the Sasquatch to be slowly evolving as a human? So maybe from what it was, go back to like a Gigantopithecus
right.
kind of animal to now. Would there be a case for that slowly evolving, from the stories from, because every culture from the Himalayas to everywhere has these stories of Yeti, Sasquatch, Bigfoot. Would there be a case then for an evolution of Sasquatch?
Well, first let's take that sort of pan global distribution of wildmen, the notion of wildmen, and many people, when they reflect on that, think these must all be manifestations of the same thing. Well, one of the things that we've been learning here in the past 20 years or more is that hominin and hominoid. So if we use hominoids in the taxonomic sense, not in the colloquial sense of human-like or man-like, but rather members of the superfamily Hominoidea, which includes us and the apes. So if we look at all those hominoids and their evolution, we're witnessing just a small fraction of the taxonomic diversity that has existed over the last 10, 12 million years. Excuse me. And even our own lineage, instead of being a single file march from them to us, if you will, we're one terminal branch of an extremely bushy family tree, even excluding the great apes. We include the great apes, I mean, it trebles the known species within the superfamily hominoid. And what we're finding too is that many of these very diverse branches have persisted alongside us until very, very recently. The hobbit, Homo floresiensis, really brought that home, because what a ringer that was. Here was something that at first, to shoehorn it in to a preconception of a cubbyhole for it, it was thought that it must have been a dwarfed Homo erectus, even though it had a brain the size of a chimpanzee. And it had no cranial features that allied it with Homo erectus at all. And I was asked to review the paper and looked at particularly at the postcranial skeleton, and it looked like an Australopithecine or an early Homo, like Homo habilis, which essentially just is a Australopithecine with a slightly bigger brain. Not much by way of major innovation like we see when we get to Homo erectus or Homo ergaster. And I said, this has nothing to do with Homo erectus. In fact, it shouldn't even be called Homo floresiensis, because it hasn't crossed that what has been called historically the cerebral Rubicon, where it was thought you had to have at least this big of a brain before we're going to call you Homo. And the tools, the artifacts that were alleged, and the quote controlled fire, evidence of controlled fire, was an extremely thin argument. Couldn't really be justified. So you've got a little hairy hominin that's 3.5 feet tall, that has a brain the size of a chimpanzee, that at best is using little flake tools that now we know Australopithecines were also using. The fire was probably just opportunistic, if at all, but it's only 50,000 years old. And those are characteristics of hominins that are supposed to be 2 to 3 million years old. So what happened here, So this should have really rocked the boat, and it did kind of. It should have it should have shaken the mindset to make people a little more open-minded about the prospects of things like the Yeti and Sasquatch, and it did some. Henry Gee wrote an op-ed for Nature magazine, the journal Nature, in which he basically said, maybe this should give us some pause, and there might be a kernel of truth. I mean, because the people in Flores and other parts of Indonesia have been describing little hairy people that live up in the mountains for generations, but they've always been just dismissed as folk. Now all of a sudden, so you've got Homo floresiensis, you've got Homo erectus in Southeast Asia, maybe as young as 25,000 years. You've got Homo heidelbergensis outside of Beijing that's probably as young as 20,000 years. You've got Neanderthals that possibly between 10 and 20,000 years. And so, I mean, it's just 10, 20,000 years is a wink of the eye in terms of the fossil record and dates of most recent appearance, or latest appearance. That's nothing. So why would we think that that there couldn't be, as I like to call them, relic hominoids? So not all the same, a lot of diversity, and there is a context for this. Now, your question about evolving, you always have to be careful about in terms of, with 2020 hindsight. It appears that nature has this goal in mind, that we're the result, we're the acme of evolution. But nature is absolutely blind as far as the future. It has no orientation to what's on the horizon or what's coming up. A really good example was a fun sort of straw man was proposed by Dale Russell, who was a Canadian paleontologist, and he took the fact that there were these bipedal dinosaurs back in the Cretaceous, these dromaeosaurs that were like the velociraptors of Jurassic Park, that had remarkably big brains for a dinosaur. They had brain to body ratios that were on par with some primitive mammals. And his thought was, well, as brainy as these things are, what if they hadn't gone extinct at the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary? What if they had survived? Would their trajectory that they were on have resulted in a sentient dinosaur, a dinosauroid? And he created this imaginary upright standing bipedal tailless flat-faced big-eyed reptilian creature with a bulbous head to in case. And then it became well, it was a fascinating
that hurts my head.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thought exercise. What would be the selection pressures? I often use this and show my students, and in human anatomy, what would be or in evolution better, because when we're talking about natural selection, what would be the selection pressures that would shape this dinosaur, which is cantilevered, pronagrade forward, has this big tail to balance the rest of the body, head and neck, over two limbs, has these short three-toed fingers with long claws, has a long snout with a mouthful of teeth. What would be the selection pressure for our broad, flattened chest with our shoulder blades on the back? Well, the only the reason we look like that is the same reason chimpanzees look like that, for hanging under branches with our arm elevated up above the shoulder joint and suspending with tension on those structures. So did this dinosaur go through an arboreal phase to reshape it, in this thought model? So it kind of goes back to Gigantopithecus. What would be the motivation? What would be the selection pressure? And would it have happened that this bipedal creature, does freeing the hands automatically select for tool use? Does tool use automatically select for increased brain size? This has been something debated for 200 years in anthropology. Which came first, chicken or the egg? Which came first, big brains or bipedalism? And it becomes kind of a tautology in a way, and you just have to acknowledge that there's a certain degree of serendipity in the way in which lineages evolved. So I don't think, I mean, I think it's that there isn't evidence to suggest, or should I say the simpler explanation for what evidence we have for Sasquatch anyway. Now we're talking about Sasquatch, that it is a bipedal ape, that it has its massive body size, its lack of evidence of tool use, of lack of fire control, controlled fire of complex language, etc. All those things suggest that it just muscles its way through. Now, having said that, there are other branches on this bushy tree, and some of them may be a little more closely allied to our recent past, our recent ancestors. For example, in Russia, the quote Bigfoot equivalent is called the almas, but it's not equivalent. Its description is and behaviors, more important, the behaviors are quite different. It's often described as being only about 5.5 to 6 feet tall, covered with hair, but with differentiated head hair often. It is attributed with using stone tools. A British archaeologist doing her doctoral work over in the borderlands there by Mongolia was collecting these Mousterian points, which are attributed to Neanderthals. She shows them to the local people, and they go, "Oh, yeah, the Almas make those. Why are you interested in those?" Who are the Almas? Oh, they're these backwards hillbillies. They're kind of strange. They try to talk to us, but they really can't. They're covered with hair. They oftentimes don't wear clothing. But we trade with them sometimes. They reportedly will leave out produce from the garden, and the Almas will leave venison and rabbits and things in return. So, which is an interesting kind of reciprocation, and it suggests maybe, as is also suggested by the coincidence of occurrence, these Almas reports come from areas where we do have remains of Neanderthals. It was part of the Neanderthal range. In fact, the Neanderthals probably ranged even further from out of Europe into Western Asia than currently understand. We're now learning a little bit about the Denisovans, which is another close relative.
Yeah.
And they may have extended all the way to the eastern seashore and down into New Guinea, into the islands of Indonesia, so forth. So anyway, the point is the fruit basket has apples and oranges and even a banana maybe in there. There's a spectrum of diversity. It's interesting because in 1960, Ivan Sanderson wrote I think one of the most interesting authoritative treatments of this topic. And at that time, this is before the age of the internet and the dispersal. This is all information that he gleaned through correspondence and through travel and rifling through documents and histories and so forth to gather all these anecdotes and all this material. He concluded that there were at least 4 types. One was the giant type, which he had just become familiar with, which was the Sasquatch. Then there was the Almas, and many different names. He had quite an exhaustive list of native names for these creatures, but he referred to it as a Neanderthaloid. And then there was a much more ape-like form in the Himalayas that he felt, it was at the root of the Yeti. And then the little people, not only of Southeast Asia, but he even has a few other pygmy forms in South America, for example, the Duende and Siddhartha and so forth, and in Africa. There was one in Africa as well. The Ogagwe, I think, is the term, one of the terms. There's a fascinating book just written by Garrett Patterson. I'll give him a plug. I just reviewed his book, and there's a review published in the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, the journal that I edit. But Garrett Patterson, Garrett with a TH, he has written numerous books on natural history. His most known for his conservation work, trying to gain better protection for elephants and lions in Africa. He was researching a very cryptic population of elephants down in South Africa, in down southeastern the coastal mountains of South Africa, where there are still remnant forests and shrublands. And but in addition to describing these very ghost elephants, rare almost to the point of being mythological themselves, he had three first-hand encounters, and collected stories of the Otang, it was called Otang, which, based on its description, is some relic Australopithecine by all accounts. Australopithecine or early Homo, possibly Homo naledi, for example. We have this odd discovery of a hominin species that had a sort of a mosaic of primitive and derived characteristics, but for the most part, it looked like an Australopithecine in many respects. It's given the term Homo naledi, but it's right there on that cusp. Showing characteristics that you would associate with Australopithecines from 2 to 3 million years ago, and when the dates came back, it was just a couple 100,000 years. It overlapped the appearance of modern Homo sapiens. So, man, I mean, if that doesn't make you wonder about recent eyewitness accounts by sober, experienced, professional conservationists and naturalists of a upright walking bipedal, hominin, possibly existing, then I don't know what does. But
there is so many things there, Jeff, that I would love to pull you back on, but I've already forgotten half of them. So at some point, I will have to re-listen to this, and we will have to speak to you again at some point. There's so many things there that I would love to branch out into.
I need a stop sign, like a crossing guard.
We'll go back. I suppose it makes sense, though, if you're talking about them coming, down that eastern Cape of Africa, between the cradle of civilization. You think about the fact that in the waters off Africa, the caecilianth was discovered, millions of years after it was supposed to have been extinct.
Right.
That whole neck of the woods, there must be. It makes sense. And as you say, if that doesn't get you at least going, then you're closing off. And I think that's when you grow up, you think, well, science looks for facts and information. And it's only as you get a little bit older that you realise that sometimes within science, and then with any, field, people find their niches of, this is my area, and if it doesn't quite fit in there, it does. And you must experience that, obviously, with the research that you're into. But if you're talking about from a pure science basis, you can't immediately just discount something just because you don't think it exists.
Right.
Like I've never seen, I'm trying to think, if I hadn't been to a zoo, for example, I would never have seen, or we didn't have televisions, I wouldn't have seen zebras, I wouldn't have seen any of the great apes that you're talking about. Does that mean they don't exist? If you're taking it to that extreme level.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, it's all too easy to sit, comfortably in your armchair and pontificate about what is and isn't real, and discount the eyewitnesses who have seen something. And we're not just talking a flash of fur or a bump in the night. I mean, I have talked to so many people, some who I've come to be very good friends with, closely acquainted with. I know their character, and they really saw something. And it, I've been through all the things with and certainly acknowledge some of the caveats that go with eyewitness testimony. And I was doing a radio show one time, and the caller asked me if I was familiar with Elizabeth Loftus and her work. She's a psychologist who has gained some notoriety because of her research that suggests that eyewitness testimony is unreliable, especially when talking about in the legal sense, legal litigations and so on. And I answered yes, I was familiar. Obviously, was familiar with her work, and I said I don't really see quite. I mean, I see some applications, but not whole cloth. And he goes, well, if you're familiar with her work, then and you acknowledge that, you have to discount all eyewitness testimony as just unreliable. It's not good data. I said, well, it's a little different, when the little old lady is standing in front of the lineup of suspects of a purse snatching, and she has to try to pick out which one's the guy who, of all these similar looking people, is the one in particular that snatched her purse, versus, say, an experienced outdoorsman who had seen something under good conditions of observation, and here lined up before him is a moose, a deer, a wolf, a bear, a Bigfoot, and a hiker. I said it's kind of apples and oranges. They're not the same. And in fact, it's interesting that in the past couple decades there's been a bit of a backlash and a pushback by researchers that have actually demonstrated the remarkable reliability of eyewitness to recollect details. I mean, you have to look at the circumstances and the application. But anyway, but he just got more and more frustrated as we kind of discussed this, and finally, in exasperation, he says to me, if there was an 800-pound gorilla out there in the woods, people would be seeing it. And I said, well, that's kind of where this conversation started, isn't it? But people are seeing it. But you're a priori discounting their testimony based on your assumption that it's unreliable. You can't have it both.
Way to trip yourself up, huh?
But anyway,
so one of the things that's quite interesting is I do quite a lot of hiking and these kind of things, and if even in Scotland, where we don't have it's not a huge country, we don't have great areas of woods and hills. I've been in wooded areas that are maybe 10 acres. It's not big, but the wood, it gets so dense and dark.
Yeah.
That you sometimes just walking through there and you're kind of going,
yeah,
this is quite, it's so dense. You think anything could be in here. So if you take that and multiply it by thousands of millions of times in, the Northwest that you're saying, where the woods are enormous, you think there really could be, not even just Sasquatch. There could be any number of unidentified species in there that we just don't have evidence of.
The folklorist would jump on that sentiment and argue that that's the very essence of what this whole phenomenon is. That it's the wild man of the woods, after all, isn't it? It isn't the wild mans of the plains or the big sky country, the wide open spaces. It's the wild man of the deep, dark, the denizen of the deep, dark, mysterious forest that harbors all of these monstrous things. And so it's simply a manifestation of our, a personification rather of our fear of that dark, unknown, and you have that reaction. It's just part of the psyche. But the thing is, it's not universal. It doesn't show up in every culture, and it certainly doesn't show up the same in every culture, as we pointed out. And yet, the differences have remarkable consistency with some of the paleontological and phylogenetic evolutionary scenarios that we're now starting to gain an understanding of, that certainly was unknown to the European peasant of 200-300 years ago, or earlier even. I mean, you go back, the earliest literary tradition in Western culture, the Gilgamesh epic, and you've got the hero and the co-star. And who's the co-star? A wild man, covered with hair, that flowed in the wind like the grain. She was the grain in the field, but that knew nothing of civilization, that frolicked with the animals. The animals didn't fear him, so forth, so forth. And it wasn't until he was sort of ceremoniously seduced by the temple priestess that
the Epic of Gilgamesh is that the another way of another culture's Noah's Ark? Is that correct?
Well, there's a connection there to stories that seem to be similar to Noah's Ark. Yeah, survives the great flood, exactly. But and in search of eternal youth, immortality, the quest for immortality. So there's all those themes, and so that's why and that's the kind of double-edged aspect of this phenomenon, is that the literalists or the literarists and historians and folklorists and so forth point to this as an archetype of the human psyche. The wild man image crops up over and over and over, and its hairiness is just an artistic metaphor of wildness, non uncivilized. So, but see, and the thing is, it doesn't, in my mind, it doesn't have to be either or. If such a creature exists, and our species has had interaction with these non-human hominids of various stripe for the entire duration of our existence, it stands to reason that our myths, our stories, and our culture would have elements of those things. I mean, our culture doesn't evolve in a vacuum, and there are other Aesop's fables. There are other characters. There are other animals. You look at, and this is one of the things about the Native American lore, where the wild man of the woods features and wild woman of the woods features quite prominently. And they have other mythical creatures, the thunderbird and so forth, but they all pretty much trace back to real animals. And of course, and even the unembellished real animals have personalities, have characteristics. The clever or the trickster coyote, for example, or the raven, the wise raven, so forth, and all these different things. So I don't think that's the problem. As when you get into this, well, it's got to be this or this. Well, no. I think if it's real, we should see the two of them, and they're going to be intimately interwoven with one another. And in reality, that's where that's what I experienced. That's my impression, and my interaction with Native Americans who are familiar with their traditions. Now there are fewer and fewer, unfortunately, that are, just as with us, but our cultural underpinnings and roots and so forth. But where they are, that seems to be the case. I mean, for them, it's yes, they have a spiritual side, but they're just as much part of the physical landscape as any other form of wildlife, be it bear or deer or elk or coyote or raven.
And are the sightings predominantly then, or the ones that you've investigated, I suppose the word I would use, are they kind of localized to the Pacific Northwest? Are they on the East Coast? I'm thinking maybe like Maine or somewhere, on that far northeast coast of America, going up into Canada, sort of similar climates and areas, or how's that working out?
A rule of thumb, there oftentimes on the television documentaries you'll see statements that suggest that every state of the Union, every state of the United States has had reports of Bigfoot. And that may be, but there's an important distinction. There may be reports, but there may not be Sasquatch actually there, because there are misidentifications. There are, delusional people, and and as we alluded to, not all eyewitnesses are equally reliable or credible based on their experience, their motivation, their interpretation, perception, etc., etc. There's some good evidence, and it's an interesting story, but I won't go into the whole length of the story. But basically, a study was done, and one of the outcomes of the study was a remarkable congruence between the distribution of black bear and Sasquatch reports, and so much so that they, it turns out, it was meant sort of tongue in cheek, but it was taken as a serious conclusion. They suggested that that was the explanation for Sasquatch reports. Just misidentified black bear. Well, if you look at the black bear distribution, I mean, it's another large omnivore. So its habitat, its niche requirements are going to have some similarities, convergences with Sasquatch. And certainly there would be a range overlap. So if you look at black bear distribution across North America, it's remarkable that it does take in those habitats and those areas where I would give it more credible with eyewitness accounts and corroboration with footprints and other trace evidence come from. So the Pacific Northwest, obviously historically the most well-known, although well, I shouldn't even say that. You go back to the more historic newspaper accounts and so forth of from a young United States, 1800s and so on and back. And there are reports of wild men, of gorillas, of different things like this that could be representative of Sasquatch, and if they are reliable accounts. And there's obviously there's room for journalistic shenanigans, but I don't think you can write off every report like that. When they appear on April 1st, then so that raises a question of what the motivation for publishing it was. But so, in other words, Pacific Northwest, the Intermountain West, the Rocky Mountains, up across the boreal forests of Canada, down across the Great Lakes area. As you point out, the New England states, Maine and Vermont, New Hampshire, and so forth, down the backside of the Appalachian Mountains, and then sort of through the deep South, hooking back up to Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, and the Mississippi basin there. It's actually quite hot and tepid, in many ways. It makes it very wet.
Jeff,
So basically,
I'm sorry. Is this where most of your casts come from? This whole area.
Exactly.
Okay.
My collection is obviously predominantly from the Western United States, because that's just out of necessity of limitations of time and so forth. I've just kind of focused there, and there are fewer credible casts, as you might expect, given the population density. Even though you've got bear populations, you look at, I gave a talk in Georgia, and I can't remember now the numbers for the individual states in the South, but we're talking most of those states along the Appalachia. There's maybe between several hundred to 1,000 or so, several thousand black bear in those states. You compare that to the state of Idaho, where there's 35,000 black bear. British Columbia has 115,000 black bear. So that says a lot about the human population and the consequent encroachment and degradation of not necessarily degradation, but development of the habitat, reduction of the forest lands and so forth, and therefore reduction in bear population. But that's something I often do when someone mails me a report from back east, or they have a description of a sighting, or they've found a scuff for a bed that they think might be Sasquatch. One of the first things I'll do is just look up on the internet and find the distribution map for black bear in their state. And if there's no black bear, then you have to question. Now, it's very possible. This is always a caveat that I add to that disclaimer, and that is, we have some hints about the possible social organization, social structure of this species, and I think, based on a number of different factors, that it's most likely, they're largely solitary. The males dominate an area of land. So like an orangutan, unlike gorillas dominate several females, and they move around as a unit, and their ranges actually kind of overlap a bit. But with orangutans, they're quite solitary as well. They dominate a territory. That territory happens then to also be co-occupied by some females. And those females, usually when they come into receptivity, which is pretty infrequent, they seek out the dominant male. And so he has exclusive access by rights to his claim to that territory. Anyway, so what that means is the male offspring, when they start to come into puberty, then the male is not going to tolerate them being around. is going to drive them out. And they're going to be, until they get big and strong, they're going to have to be out on the fringes, in the secondary, tertiary habitats. So when sometimes there might be a fairly, reasonable or even credible, corroborated, that is, report of a Sasquatch in a kind of an out-of-the-way place. Well, it could very well be it's, one of these, what Dr. Krantz used to call a rogue male, who's been driven out of his natal territory, and he has to strike off, across the farmlands at night to get to a territory of his own, or just bide his time until he's big enough to usurp or replace a retiring dominant.
I mean, that gives me a terrifying thought of 2 8-foot-tall hominids having like a rutting season, as we would call it over in Scotland. You like when the elks and their clashing heads, just like a picture like an epic wrestling style grappling match between two. Like when the gorillas do it, and you see a nature documentaries and they bang their chest and bull rush at each other in like displays of dominance, and that moving on towards actual combat, going through the gesturing and posturing of don't come at me, bro. I'm bigger and stronger than you.
That's right. Well, and you brought to mind, I watched a documentary where they were following this one group, and the dominant male was being challenged by another male, and he would repeatedly call. He'd start first thing in the morning. He wouldn't actually come and confront him face to face, but just that calling was making everybody in the group anxious and nervous. Well, we get reports of Sasquatch where the calls go on all night, these blood-curdling screams. Well, maybe that's what it is. It could well be, because those loud calls serve a number of purposes. One would be to identify themselves, to space themselves. But another important factor would be to challenge a dominant male. And, so those kind of reports that's the kind of behavior you would expect, given the emerging model of social structure that is based on a lot of other bits and pieces of information, which include the solitary occurrence, the repeat appearance of footprints or eyewitness testimony of a particular color phase or something, or and et cetera, et cetera. All these things kind of add up, and by analogy, we can see similar patterns in other great apes. That it's interesting. You look at the great apes, and no two species have the same social structure. They've evolved particularly distinct social structures in each of the great ape species, and so you never say never, because there's no reason that Sasquatch could show a totally unique social structure that has only some superficial resemblances to, as I've suggested, to say an orangutan. But that's one thing. I mean, people, I've had critics, colleagues who have said, well, that they can't be this because the great apes don't do this or that. Well, we're talking about the tip of a now extinct iceberg. The species of great apes that exist today are themselves relic hominoids. They're threatened, endangered populations that are hanging on by the skin of their fingernails, trying to survive in tropical refugia. Whereas, 20 million years ago, 15, 20 million years ago, there was a diversity of great apes that had tremendous range of body size, up to Gigantopithecus, that had a huge diversity of locomotor adaptations and dietary adaptations, that inhabited flooded forests, that inhabited tropical forests, mountainsides, shrublands, woodlands, even grasslands. So they were quite diverse. And so to say, well, this couldn't be, is just so myopic and so naive. It's really frustrating sometimes. It's almost like our conversation about politics. How can people say or think things like that?
Yeah. One thing. Sorry, Ali. One thing that I was going to ask you: do you find the scientific community as a whole, they kind of want to leave the past as is and just keep moving forward? So to say, well, that's not possible, so we just won't think about it and just move this way. Do you find this is something that they don't want to suggest,
yeah.
they don't want to accept maybe that they're wrong, and there is many other possibilities?
Well, yes and no. I mean, certainly there's an inertia in an institutional inertia, and but having said that, people make their careers by falsifying long-standing ideas. I mean, that's the way you get a name for yourself a lot of times, if that's your goal in this business. And there are people that are motivated by that. There are also young people who have not had the proper training in the history of the discipline and have, for example, I talked about this sort of change, as Kuhn would say, a paradigm shift in anthropology from what was called I came in was studying right on the end, on the downward end of it, called the single species hypothesis. The notion that the hominin niche was so unique, there could be only one species in it. The old evolutionary adage, no two species can occupy the same niche. Well, it was thought that bipedalism, braininess, and above all culture, possession of culture, was exclusive to a single hominin species. And so evolution took place with successive replacement or modification and extinction. And so there could, it's kind of like Highlander, there can be only one, and that's fallen by the wayside. I mean, first they discovered that there were these robust and gracile Australopithecines. They were trying to explain them as male and female to start with, but that fell apart. But then it was like, well, they're just bipedal chimps, essentially. Their brains aren't very big. They don't really have culture. So they kicked the can down the path a little bit. Once Homo emerged, then there could be only one. Well, no sooner had they said that than Richard Leakey demonstrated in East Africa Homo rudolfensis, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and robust Australopithecines all living simultaneously at the same time, right there in East Africa. So boom, kick the bucket further down. Well, okay, but once Homo sapiens emerged, we're the last hominin standing. There are books by that title, The Last Hominin Standing. Well, why? Now we know that there was Neanderthals are a separate species. I mean, no one can argue that they're not a separate species any longer. We've got Homo neanderthalensis. We have Homo, as I mentioned, we've got Denisovans, we've got Heidelbergensis, we've got the Hobbit, we've got Niladi, all coexisting. Well, not quite Niladi earlier, but anyway. But the point being, there was a bevy of others coexisting until almost the present, almost the present. So, I forgot my train of thought here. Why? Oh, paradigm shift. So I had, I really wanted to drive this message home, and I had submitted an abstract for a presentation of a speech or podium presentation. I was going to also include data, and talk about the where the evidence was pointing, but I wanted to provide this theoretical context so that it wasn't just Bigfoot, and they immediately thought supermarket tabloid, but that they saw that this conversation is rooted in the context of patterns and process of human evolution. One of the reviewers said, there's been no paradigm shift. I'm not aware of any paradigm shift. I mean, that kind of thing. How can you say something like that? Again, I mean, it just reveals a naivete. This was a fairly young person. I knew who this person was because this particular reviewer wasn't anonymous. He was one of the organizers of the meetings. And because my abstract was rejected, and I protested and and I couldn't, first of all, I didn't get notification at the deadline when I was supposed to be notified so I could make my plans. And they kept stringing me along before they finally said it was denied. It was rejected, and when I appealed, there is no appeal process, but when I requested an explanation, I couldn't get one, and so I resorted to the executive committee, and no one would answer me. No one would reply until finally, I guess they put the screws to the this one individual, because then he wrote back and but he was the one who said, there's no paradigm shift. I'm not aware of any paradigm shift, and he said, you're presenting information that you've discussed in the past at these meetings. And I go, no, I'm not. This is all new evidence that I'm presenting. That's the kind of thing you run into. So yeah, it's more, there's quite a spectrum. I mean, I could write a book just about the human side of science, that I've experienced as a result of my involvement in this. And you get different reactions, different personalities. Someone actually said to me, indirectly through the editor, again, we were invited, the two of us, one of my coworkers and I were invited to write a review paper of the kind of the state of knowledge. What was the evidence for Sasquatch and the existence of Sasquatch or other relic hominoids? And so we did. We put together. I thought it was a really good paper, and it was just, it was very good summary, and the editor was quite delighted with it, but it got squashed by the Scientific Advisory Board. This was the California Academy of Sciences, and they wanted the publication of the paper for their sort of semi-technical magazine, California Wild, it was called at the time. And when I pressed again, I mean, I don't just roll over for these things. The principal objector, antagonist, said, they can't exist, therefore they don't exist, and it doesn't matter what evidence they think they have. I thought of having that engraved on a placard or something to hang up somewhere to show my students what not to say if you're a scientist.
Well,
it
sounds anti-science.
Yes.
Yeah, this sounds completely like going against your own grain. It seems crazy.
Right. Yeah, no, I know.
Yeah.
It was unbelievable. And I said to him, well, you're the editor. Don't you have final call? He goes, well, in theory, yes, but I can't go against the recommendation of my scientific advisory board. They'd stop being my scientific advisory board. So it didn't get published. But that person, holds has a special place in my my heart. The list of people to serve up crow if the opportunity ever.
Yeah, definitely. Do you think then that they're saying that, just off the back of that statement there, Jeff, you're saying, it can't exist, so it doesn't exist, therefore it can't exist, that almost confirming itself. But do you think maybe like a DNA or a genome from a piece of evidence would be the holy grail that would finally turn everyone around?
Well, maybe there's no precedent for recognizing a novel species on the basis of DNA alone.
Okay.
DNA has been used to differentiate, say, subspecies or sibling species or whatever. But in those cases, the bones or the skins exist in the museums already, and they're just kind of refining the taxonomy. But there is a growing literature that in the professional literature that discusses or debates the should we be ethically as a science be to the point where, in the case of rare and endangered species, where the lethal harvesting of a type specimen could have unknown impact on that on that population, especially if you were talking about large hominoids. Should we be able to rely to establish a new species on the basis of a type specimen? I mean, sorry, on a DNA, a voucher DNA, a genome, as you mentioned. And maybe Sasquatch will be the test case for that. There's a couple of cases, I think, where, and I don't know how, if they have been formally recognized or just kind of put in limbo. But there have been some sea mammals, for example, some pinnipeds that have been identified on the basis of photographs or sketches due to sightings at sea. You know,
Yeah.
it's some would argue, well, yes, but there are others, similar species. It's not like you're suggesting the unicorn exists, but that's the thing. The advance of paleoanthropology over the past quarter century has made it such that the notion of relic hominoids isn't like talking about unicorns. I mean, it as some of my colleagues have acknowledged, we should expect there to be such things out there,
Yeah.
shouldn't we?
Oh, absolutely. It's funny that you mention unicorns as well, talking to two Scottish guys, because you might be aware that the national animal of Scotland is the unicorn.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Well, see, at one time, I would show this slide in one of my talks, and it was from an old medieval bestiary, and it has some really rather fanciful creatures like dragons and unicorns, and I pointed out how some of these have been explained now and recognized as being just rather embellished representations of animals, like a crocodile, a saltwater crocodile. And but then there's others that still have been relegated to mythology, like the unicorn. One of my colleagues, who's been one of my best sounding boards on this kind of topic, because he shares many similar interests, but he comes up to me after, he says, Jeff, I think you misstepped there. He said, go back and read the original descriptions of unicorns. They've got thick skin, thick plated skin. They've got big round feet. Their horn is not on the middle of their forehead, but it's on the end of their nose. They're descriptions of rhinoceros.
Yeah.
And so, of course, the medieval unicorn that's captured by the Virgin, the fair maiden, has a much different appearance. This kind of, gracile colt or goat cross with goatee and horn. It's a very different image than a lumbering rhinoceros. But who knows?
You've just ruined the national animal of Scotland. Next you'll be telling us Nessie's not real. Jesus.
A unicorn on steroids,
Yeah.
The man unicorn, one that could wear a kilt and not do it.
Unicorn in two of Scotland's great animals.
Yeah. That's I tell you, there's so many things now clicking in my head. I've got this far too much information in my head now, Jeff.
Well, I'm surprised you haven't asked me about the Grey Man yet.
Well,
the Grey Man of Ben McDouey.
I don't, unfortunately, don't profess to know a lot about that and the traditions, and it's interesting though that Bigfoot in Britain is all the rage now, and there have been books even written about all the sightings, But as you point out, there's precious little forest left on the continent there, on the island, rather, the Isles, and an animal like, I don't know, if I've never actually looked to see if there is a wild black bear population in Great Britain. I don't believe there is.
Not native. If you again going with it, you're probably talking. They estimate around 50,000 years ago the bears last kind of sort of maybe the tail end of one of the only stages.
The only thing that there's been sightings of is a big cat. That's pretty much about it. That's about it. There is areas. I mean, Scotland's a small country, but I've covered quite a lot of the country. There is areas in the Highlands, in the glens, and the there's nothing there. It's just wasteland, and it almost impossible to survive there. So maybe there is in there. We never know, but it's not really big enough a country. It's compared to America, it's tiny.
I'm admiring as well behind you, Jeff, the still from the famous Patterson film.
Oh yes,
behind you. That's from, isn't it?
It is indeed. Yeah. Indeed, it is. Yeah.
Yeah, probably
that still stands as one of the most significant pieces of evidence, and by far the most compelling photographic evidence. But I tell you, there was a time early on in my involvement in this subject when I was a little bit reticent to direct too much attention or place too much significance on that one piece of evidence. But I tell you, now as my own understanding of anatomy and kinematics and so forth has matured, and as I've come to know the surviving participant, Bob Gimlin, personally, and worked with other investigators as well, examining other aspects of the film itself and the nature of the images on the film, in addition to the subject. I'm as convinced as I can be, short of having stood there on the sandbar on that fateful day. But if I only had the footprints, the images of the footprints and the casts that were made, I would be absolutely convinced that they are 100% authentic. So that has always been a bit of a touchstone to go back.
I think even the story you told right at the start of this podcast around, that 30 or 40, I think you said, footprints in the casts you took that day, and the fact that there was skin ridges and pressure changes, and even just listening to that without having seen them, I don't know about you, Chris, but even I was like, it just seems like so almost counterintuitive that someone would go to that degree of trying to hoax it. That surely can only be.
One thing that's always...
And some have. I mean, there was back in the day, Ray Wallace did have carved wooden feet that he'd stomped out some footprints with, and Ray Pickens. And more recently, there's some of these internet trolls, skeptics that have attempted to plant evidence, and they were all quickly uncovered. There were telltale signs. I don't know if you saw, there was a documentary by Les Stroud, Survivor Man. And in this series, Survivor Man Bigfoot, he came to my lab for one of the episodes. Well, he had surreptitiously hired a Hollywood makeup artist, a makeup engineer, who had created a false foot that Les had experimented in the field with to see what would be involved. What would be involved to fabricate the prosthetic, and then could he make convincing footprints in the field? Well, he made some plaster casts from those, and he brought them to my lab and presented them as ostensibly the real thing, and asked me what I thought about them. And just purely by coincidence, I had a cast sitting there off to the side. One particular one is extremely clear footprint from Washington State. I said, well, it's interesting. There's actually some real convergent similarities in the shape of the toes and the conformation of the foot here to this. And I reached across, I pulled this other track, and I laid it down beside it. And I had real suspicions about these to begin with, but I was trying to be diplomatic, and so I was kind of qualifying. Eventually, I just kind of said, well, I'd have to take some time and examine these further before making a decision. He looked at me, had this little wry smile come across his face, and in fact, then he acknowledged that they were hoaxed, and they were hoaxed based on the engineer had used this cast that I had laid down beside it as the very model from which he patterned
sneaky.
His so it was kind of it was an interesting exercise, interesting demonstration. It could have gone poorly, I guess, but I mean, I'm not by any means foolproof on this kind of thing, but nor do I claim to be. But in this case, the similarity, and that's happened in the past, where people have presented things to me, and I go, well, where did you get this copy of? And I open up a drawer and pull out a cast that I'm familiar with, and it's a copy of. Oh, I don't know what you're talking about. And I go, oh, yes, you do.
Yeah.
Does sold this to you then?
One of the things that's when coming into these things, Jeff, you have to I watch a lot of videos like this, Bigfoot and UFO videos and all this kind of stuff, and I've watched Bigfoot videos, UFO videos, and you'll listen to somebody talking for 5 minutes and you'll go, this person is crazy, absolutely crazy. So what Ali was saying was, when you're talking about these the first 15 minutes when you're talking about these footprints, and just the detail that you can go into about, the difference in pressure, and you go, oh, okay, this makes sense. You know,
Yeah.
I've listened to countless UFO encounter videos, and a lot of them you go, this person is out of their mind. But there is ones, Betty and Barney Hill, that famous UFO incident from like the 50s. When you listen to that and you go,
Yeah.
this this is interesting. They seem like this has terrified them, and you could just tell, as you're saying, in terms of sometimes eyewitness testimonies, just by talking to somebody, you go, yeah, this seems, short of me seeing a Bigfoot, it seems,
Exactly.
you know,
And you touch on a really good point too, and it's not appreciated by all, especially by those who have just a very superficial exposure to the subject matter, through a tabloid magazine or through an internet web page or something. But it does make sense. That's the point, is that it's not like this incongruous paranormal phenomenon that just kind of drops out and runs counter to everything we understand in nature. Instead, what I find is that it, as I said, there is a context. It makes sense ecologically. It makes sense paleontologically, evolutionarily. They're biomechanically, functionally. These aren't just feet, human feet facsimiles that are just blown up, stretched out. They are feet that are distinct from those of humans in the very ways that a biomechanist would appreciate and understand if they have the wherewithal to do that. And so you've got this very coherent and consistent. And when it comes to the Patterson Gimlin film, is a great example. You know that you always have to view that in the context of when it was filmed in 1967. There was a gentleman, a primatologist by the name of John Napier, who viewed the film. He was one of the first to view the film. And in one of his published comments, well, he wrote a book. He was impressed. He wasn't ready to vindicate or authenticate, rather, validate the film, and he spoke very skeptically of it. But he said he couldn't put his finger really on any one thing, except he said when he looks at it from the waist up, it looks virtually like an ape. It looks like a big gorilla, but from the waist down, it looks like a human proportions. And he said I cannot conceive of such a hybrid of structure existing in nature. One or the other has to be false, ergo the whole thing is false. It's a hoax. Well, but he still was impressed enough by the whole prospect of Bigfoot Sasquatch that he spent the next 5 years writing a book, which was published in the early 70s. Well, interestingly, and that's where that statement appeared. That's where that in print about this hybrid. Waist up, it looks like an ape. The waist down, it looks like a human. Well, shortly thereafter, I mean, literally within the next few years, Don Johanson is all over the papers with his discoveries of Lucy. And Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, provided much more complete postcranial skeletal, associated postcranial skeletal material of these bipedal Australopithecines. And isn't it interesting? In the popular press, they were described as from the waist up, looking like a chimpanzee, but from the waist down, looking like a human. Isn't it interesting how evolution has combined in a mosaic fashion these unexpected characteristics? Well, wait a minute. 5 years ago, that was the linchpin that hooked or hung up Napier accepting the Patterson Gimlin film. And yet, it anticipated the unusual, inconceivable combination of traits that we now know characterize these early bipedal Australopithecines. And when I have a presentation that I developed at the anniversary of the film, 50th anniversary, and the theme of it basically is that we're looking at the film now with 2020 50-year hindsight.
Yeah.
And the film actually anticipates, in some cases by decades, aspects of early hominin evolution that we had no clue about in 1867. And certainly Roger Patterson, a ne'er-do-well rodeo rider who couldn't hold the job very long, who had his character attacked right and left. How would he have orchestrated, masterminded a hoax that wasn't just an off-the-shelf gorilla costume, but was this remarkable representation of what we now understand early hominins to look like?
Yeah,
that is interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember seeing the video on over here in the UK when I must have been certainly pre-teen anyway, maybe primary school age, and it was on Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World,
Yes.
the great TV show, and I remember seeing the footage and me and my dad sitting talking about it, my dad saying, it can't be real, that doesn't exist. But
yeah,
as you say, the more and more you look into it, particularly some of it yourself with such a background in anatomy particularly,
right.
It just seems to become, more and more probable.
Yeah. Oh, it's amazing. I have a clip that is an exceptional version of the film, where one of the problems was, people have always said, oh, it's so blurry, so jiggly and bouncy and so forth. Well, it's not really blurry. There is some motion blur, because in fact the film speed had gotten turned down. It was at somewhere between 16 and 18 frames per second instead of 22, which is your preferable frame rate for broadcast quality. But it had an infinite focus lens, so anything from 2 feet to infinity should be in focus. So it's just that people don't realize that what they see on TV is being blown up from a 16 millimeter film frame, a little figure that's only about 1.8 millimeters tall. And so the grain, people today don't even know what grain is. So the pixels, of the, it becomes pixelated or grainy as you increase the enlargement. Well, it was thought that there was evidence of kind of a hazy, out of blur, a little bit of a blur around the figure, on the objects, and what that was, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a minute. The lens was an inexpensive lens that wasn't corrected for chromatic aberration, meaning when the light passes through this cheaper lens, the refraction of the different wavelengths is varied. So some of the colors are in sharp focus, but the others are slightly out of focus. So what they did is they took a good clean copy, not the original, but one of the clean copies, and they photomicrographed it through a microscope, to enlarge it to the limits of the grain. And then they, once they had, and photographed it digitally. So once it was now digitized, it could be entered into a computer, and there are programs that can split the color channels, the color information, which is in effect, correcting for that aberration. And what they found was that the red channel was the sharpest in focus. The blue and the yellow were a little hazy. And when you subtracted that information away, isolated the red channel, over here we've got what's called you have Claritin, is a allergy medicine.
Yeah, hay fever. Yeah.
Claritin Clear, and they peel this fuzzy film off the screen effectively, virtually. Well, it has that same effect. You peel off this haze, and the image is sharper than you've ever seen it. It loses some color information, but the clarity of the image is enhanced. And then those individual frames were strung together, and in a GIF, they were stabilized and played the proper film speed. And it's really amazing to watch, because you can see boundaries and details that are they're fogged over in the original. And I'll show this to my anatomy students after they've completed the course. It's sometimes just on our review day for fun, and to get them to review surface anatomy and muscle masses based on surface anatomy. And you can start at the top and work your way down, and they can identify the trapezius and the deltoids, the lateral and long heads of the triceps. You can see the latissimus. You can see the shoulder blade sliding underneath the skin. You can see the erector spinae down paralleling the vertebral column and the great big gluteus maximus, up really high on very high flaring ilia that are on a non-human pelvis. You can see the mass of the quadriceps. You can see the quadriceps or the rectus femoris shorten and bunch up. I mean, there's a line that defines the boundary between the gluteus maximus and the hamstrings. I mean, it's just, you work your way down, you can see the heads of the gastroc, and you can see and not only see these things, but you can see them contract at the appropriate times and in the step. So it's not like somebody has sculpted foam rubber musculature underneath the suit. Oh, but wait, there wasn't foam rubber to be had in 1967. Minor detail there, but you get these movements. You can see the little fold at the armpit of the pectoralis major. You can see the muscle with the breast tissue riding down lower. And there's this one step where obviously, sometimes when you misjudge the height of a section of the sidewalk and it's about an inch lower than you expect, and come down and it jars you, you can see the shock wave go up through her leg muscles all the way to her chest, and her breast tissue go whoop, and rise and fall with the shock wave. And I mean, you sit here, my students we memorize, and it takes all of about 15 seconds for this to play, but 20 minutes later, we're still watching it and looking at all the details as you work down. No suit survives under that kind of scrutiny.
No. And you were using she, so are you 100% certain it's a female then on the parts and film?
Oh yeah, they clearly are breasts, and given her size, I mean, she's somewhere between 6.5 and 7 feet in height, and there's arguments can be made either direction, and depending on the margin of error, the measurements, and so forth. I mean, one of the most straightforward ways to measure, obviously, would be to take the foot, which we have footprints of, which was 14.5 to 15 inches. Problem is, where the foot is most vertical would be get the most precise measurement. It's reflecting light, and it overexposes a little, which makes a bit of a halo, which makes it more problematic to get a precise measurement. So if your measurement is off by 10%, well, 10% of 14 inches, 15 inches, that's an inch and a half. So if you use that as your scale, how many feet can you stack on top to get her height? Well, you've got an inch and a half times what? 5. So you can be off by 5 inches either way. Well, tendency to overestimate the height, I guess, or underestimate. But so 6.5 to 7 feet. But she's got the mammary glands that appear to be consistent. Now, there's some that have argued this kind of shows some of the silliness that comes to the surface, even from professionals. One, the breasts obviously drew attention, and when some of the experts viewed it, one of the criticisms was primates don't have hair on their breasts. And I beg to differ. I mean, even if you have nothing but human experience, if you have goose flesh, what causes goose flesh?
Yeah.
The contraction of the erector pili muscle, which is attached to the follicle of a hair. Now, you look at any female in chilly weather where you've got a view, and there's going to be goosebumps all the way across her breasts, and that means she's got fine hair follicles all the way across her breast. I mean, it's the most ridiculous comment to be made, but it was also then on top of that, it says, well, yeah, she has breasts, but she walks like a man. It must be a man in a fursuit. Well, wait a minute. Why do human females walk the way they do? Because they have a wider pelvis, moves the hip joints apart in order to provide a larger birth canal, right? Because human babies have big brains at birth. Well, do gorillas have big brains at birth? Do chimpanzees have big? Sasquatch has a head that's proportionate, say, to a gorilla, to its body mass. We would expect its neonate to have a head that's on par with a gorilla or something like that. And so it doesn't have that obstetric constraint. And so its pelvis is going to be more like a male pelvis of its own species. And it's going to walk like a male of its own species. I mean, see, this is the kind of shallow thinking, the knee-jerk reaction that exposes the quite unfortunate, the lack of professionalism, the naivete of some of these experts at the time who pontificated about what can and cannot exist, and then try to rationalize it by throwing out these really silly statements about it. And yet they get repeated over and over again in the books and literature and the skeptical writings. They always hark back to the, well, the scientists said this and this. They didn't accept it because of this and this.
Yeah. I suppose we've talked about science, searching ideally for the truth and fact, but I suppose science in some areas has evolved. If you go back to, Copernicus and Galileo and the acceptance of moving on and on, but I suppose there are some entrenched, and as you've said as well, Jeff, some people have made their career on being the expert in this, and then if something changes, they have to admit, well, my whole career of being an expert has actually been false.
I mean, Egypt is a perfect example of this, isn't it?
Yeah.
They've made a career in it, and it's now, I mean, not true.
Right.
The age of the Sphinx and the age of the pyramid.
Oh yeah, and I don't want to come across to your viewers as being anti-science in any way, or to be sour.
No, I don't think you do. I think you come across as a scientist.
Yeah, but it must be recognized that scientists, are people, and certainly I have. I'm certainly probably victim. I shouldn't say certainly. I'm likely victim of or blind to preconceptions or misinterpretations or this, that, or the other. Or but there's a lot of evidence that that bolsters. One of the blessings I've enjoyed, the benefits I've enjoyed, for example, is the cover of my book boasts an endorsement by no less than Jane Goodall, and even more impactful in some ways, or on a different level, maybe different. The foreword is written by George Schaller, one of the preeminent naturalists of our century and our generation, I should say. And when people just say ridiculous, and I should point out, neither of those endorsements endorses the existence of Sasquatch. They endorse the study of the question of the existence of Sasquatch as being meritorious and so forth. And that's all I asked, or all I expected of them. I mean, in the book, I do take a position saying the weight of the evidence, the preponderance of the evidence, in my mind, is convincing. I am convinced. I don't believe, I'm convinced. But I had a journalist sitting across the desk from me, and he wanted me to give him names of skeptics on campus, people who are critical of what I have said. And I said, why? I mean, why? First, there's no one on campus really that's qualified to comment or to critique my pronouncements in my discipline. I mean, we just don't have the depth of faculty here for that. You'd have to go somewhere to another institution or something. I said, but why would I give you that? I said, why would, and then you put the armchair comments of some, skeptic, some self-professed skeptic, on par with my comments that are the result of years and years of research, not to mention training and education behind that research. And of course they found them, but and this one journalist, he had already talked to people, just the Joe on the street, basically a student crossing campus or another member of my department, and he said, they've said some really nasty things about you. In fact, you're considered by a lot of people to be a joke. What's your response to that? And I turned behind, reached from the shelf, and took down my book, and I said, well, whose name is under that pronouncement right there on the cover? It was Jane Goodall, and I opened it up, and George Shaw. I said, you know who these people are, right? And I had to explain. He didn't know who they were, and especially George Schaller, the average person doesn't have the name recognition that Jane Goodall does. And then I opened up the cover, inside cover, and there's a whole page and a half of endorsements from state veterinarians, from anthropologists, from wildlife biologists, from game wardens, from folklorists, and so forth. And I said, "And you talked to who?" And so it's been a bit of a not a shield, but a bit of a well, in some ways it has. It certainly has deflected. When you have people of that stature, that caliber, that thoughtfulness, those credentials, and you put those up against, someone who's shooting from the hip, who has an opinion on everything. We had one of those on campus who got lots of reinforcement. He had a column in our local paper as well.
Okay.
So he had an opinion on everything, and he was in the physics department.
You know what they say about opinions.
Right. Right.
One of the things, you were talking about your book there, Jeff. So one of the things I was going to ask is there somewhere that I could buy a book and get you to sign one?
You certainly. I have to warn you, though, the postage overseas is horrendous.
Yeah,
it's not so bad for a book, but I just won't even try. Like I sometimes sell replicas of casts, even to get it across the Canadian border. The postage ends up being many times what the cast is cost, and certainly what it's worth. But for books, it's not such a big deal. But certainly, we can arrange that. Absolutely.
Yeah, that'd be a really nice thing to have, I think.
Yeah, it'd be a pleasure.
Quite a cool thing to have. So, yeah, I think we've done. Is that about 2 hours, Ali?
It's going towards 2 hours. Yeah, I think we've.
My head hurts now. So.
Well, you get me started, and it's hard to get me to stop. But
no, it was fantastic. It was really good.
Certainly cut it off at 2 hours for sure.
Yeah, no, we appreciate your time. Thank you. Just as we're kind of winding it down, we always just ask if people are looking for you on social media or looking to get in touch with you, where's the best place to do it, Jeff?
Well, I don't have a web page per se, but I have a Facebook page. It's under Don, my full name, Don Jeffrey Meldrum. And then, but otherwise, I would recommend my book is a good starting place, because while there is plenty of meat on the bones, I do think it's accessible. The chapter on footprints, I kind of pulled the stops because that was my forte, and I wanted to really come down convincingly and heavily on that data. But I've also written a couple of field guides, which also make good kind of primers. So one is a Sasquatch field guide. These are available on Amazon or through a company called Paradise K, C-A-Y, which is a little company down in Arcata, California. The second of those two is a field guide to relic hominoids around the world. So it addresses that question of multiple types, sort of rehearses Sanderson's. It's sort of a shrunken head of the next book I'm working on, which will be interesting when it eventually gets published, because it'll have been about 50 plus years since Sanderson's book, and in spite of all the developments and all the interesting things and all the research, new research and information that the internet has afforded and so forth, we pretty much re-emphasized Sanderson's original conclusions. I mean, I see a minimum of 4 types, and they mesh, align with his categories, and they're reinforced as well by good footprint evidence that seems to reiterate those distinctions which he drew in the absence of good footprint evidence for some, or at least not as extensive evidence for some of the forms that he was interested in. And then plus, when you consider, like I said, the advances that have been made in paleoanthropology in the last 50 years, I mean, it's amazing that were unknown to Sanderson at that time. It just creates a broader, deeper context for all of this. See, that was the thing. Again, when he published his book in 61, that was right at the peak of the single species hypothesis, the advocation for that idea. And so when you get a hold of the very few reviews that were written of his book, it reflects that. I mean, he just simply wasn't taken seriously, because here's the title, Abominable Snowman, Legend Come to Life. The subtitle was Subhuman Species on 5 Continents. Well, according to the party line, the consensus of the time, there were no other subhuman species out there. So this was just pure fiction in their mind. It's just absolutely no chance of accommodating the proposition. And so it was treated as such. And boy, now it's a very different backdrop against which to consider this question. And so it'll be interesting. But it's hard to find the time to get the darn project done. So I took a shortcut, wrote the abstract, and published it as this second field guide. So it gives the reader little information about the notion of that paradigm shift, the current understanding of some of the diversity and contemporaneity of species and recent persistence of species, and then looks at some of the folklore and so forth, as well as the footprint evidence and other anecdotal evidence for each of these forms around the globe, and compares and contrasts them. Because people are always asking me, what about the Yeti? Sasquatch and the Yeti the same thing? Well, no, they're not. They're very, very different, and very different origins and very different anatomies and behaviors described or attributed to them. So, sorry, I'll stop there.
What's what the coolest thing is when you speak to somebody who's so clearly passionate, about what they're talking about. That's a nice thing to see when somebody's really, really into it, and they've spent a life gathering data and studying it. It's quite a nice thing to see. It's quite a cool thing to see. So yeah.
I'm sure your students love your lectures. Like, genuinely, that's like I can imagine you like in front of the lecture of students just ruling it.
Well, I strive for that. I don't always reach that goal, but anatomy can be a rather some perceive it as being a rather tedious. It's like learning a vocabulary list, for a foreign language. But when you look at the human strategy from an evolutionary and comparative perspective, then you start to really appreciate not only the marvels, but some of the oddities and peculiarities of human anatomy and our organization, and it becomes really fun. It's if I can light that fire under a student, it's to their benefit, I think. But there are a lot of very pragmatic, what do I need to know to get through the boards exams?
Yeah.
OTPTs are very applied, very clinically minded. That's careers.
Yeah, I think I could sort of relate to that. So at high school, I was fascinated with history. I loved history, but I did enough to get a grade and get a qualification from high school. But I never did anything with it. But now I had a very good history teacher at school, and he made the actual learning of because it was sort of World War II, some stuff about Roman Britain, general stuff, but he made history so fun in terms of the learning side of it. It made me even now, I still look back to Egypt and Göbekli Tepe and stuff now, and it's dinosaurs is fascinating, and it all comes from that point. So having a good teacher is you're very lucky if you find somebody like you who's clearly loves the subject. So yeah, it's nice.
Oh, good.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Jeff. This has been an absolute outstanding. We've just hit the 2-hour mark, so an absolute outstanding. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I know me and Chris have been excited about this for the last couple of weeks. We've been sent up in the background, so I appreciate, number one, you getting back to me when I reached out a couple of weeks ago.
Sure.
Number two, I appreciate even more that you've taken 2 hours of your day to sit and talk to two Scottish guys about Sasquatch. It's the joys of the internet. Sometimes amazes me.
Absolutely, my pleasure. From a fellow Scotsman, by the way.
Oh,
Mel,
you,
look in the eastern Aberdeen Shire, and you'll find Old Meldrum tomb.
that's right. You know
Yep.
what? That's on the. I have stayed in Old Meldrum. That is on the Whiskey Trail.
Ah, really?
So yeah, I did. In fact, on this blanket, this is a blanket of marathon t-shirts and stuff like this. In fact, this t-shirt, this one here, there's a marathon that followed the Whiskey Trail, and you got a miniature of whiskey from each distillery, and that's where that was from. That's where it started.
Okay.
Was exactly there. So there you go. What a small world.
It is.
Thanks very much. I'm going to stop the recording, but thank you so much, Professor Jeffrey Meldrum. Thank you again.
Thank you.
You're quite welcome. Thank you.